The B-26 Marauder was never meant to be flown like this. Its design favored speed over forgiveness, power over comfort, and precision over mercy. Every pilot who climbed into its cockpit knew the truth. This aircraft punished hesitation and destroyed arrogance. Yet on that morning over the Pacific, the Marauder was being forced into a role no engineer had ever imagined. Not as a bomber, not as an attacker, but as a survivor trapped in enemy skies. Fuel consumption had become a silent enemy long before the Japanese fleet appeared. The gauges crept downward with merciless certainty, and every recalculation only confirmed the same grim conclusion: there was no margin left. Weather had fractured the formation hours ago. Radio contact faded into static. The crew was alone, navigating by instinct, compass, and fading daylight. Every mile flown was a gamble against gravity and flame. Then the sea below changed. What had been empty blue suddenly filled with steel. Long straight lines cut across the water. Shadows moved with unnatural coordination. Towers rose from flat decks like watchful predators. The navigator stared down, heart hammering, his mouth dry as the realization struck him with terrifying clarity. These were not escorts, not cargo ships. These were carriers, multiple Japanese aircraft carriers operating together, their decks crowded, alive, and lethal. The pilot didn't swear. He didn't shout. He simply tightened his grip and lowered the nose. Climbing would have meant death. Turning would have invited fighters. Hesitation would have been fatal. The only path left was forward, straight through, the center of the most dangerous naval formation on Earth. The engines roared louder as the aircraft descended, the Marauder slicing downward until the waves rushed past beneath the wings. Close enough to feel, close enough to kill. Japanese lookouts saw it almost too late. At first it looked unreal. An American bomber flying impossibly low, far below where bombers belonged. Alarms erupted across the fleet, echoing through steel corridors and across flight decks packed with aircraft. Officers shouted orders that collided with disbelief. This was not how attacks happened. This was not how bombers behaved. Gunners rushed to their stations, then froze. The aircraft was too low. Anti-aircraft guns could not depress far enough. Heavy cannons overshot the target entirely. Machine gunners tried to track it, but the Marauder's speed turned aiming into panic. Fighters sat helplessly on deck, wings folded, engines cold, crews watching in stunned silence as the enemy closed the distance in seconds. The first carrier filled the windshield. Its deck was alive with men, mechanics, pilots, officers, some mid-stride, some staring upward in disbelief. The Marauder crossed the bow so low that the carrier's deck markings blurred beneath its shadow. The sound of its engines crushed everything else, drowning out alarms, commands, and thought itself. For one frozen moment, American eyes met Japanese eyes. No bombs fell. No shots were fired. The bomber passed directly over the flight deck, close enough that loose equipment lifted into the air, close enough that men ducked instinctively, convinced death was unavoidable. Some dropped to the deck. Others stood rigid, unable to move, watching an enemy aircraft violate the heart of their fleet with impunity. Then it was gone. The B-26 surged forward, threading between ships like a blade through ribs. Destroyers attempted frantic course corrections. Officers screamed orders that arrived seconds too late. The Marauder had already slipped through the formation, untouched, unharmed, leaving behind only chaos and disbelief. Inside the aircraft, silence ruled. No one celebrated. No one spoke. The crew understood what they had just survived. A single mistake, 1 meter higher, 1 second slower, and the ocean would have swallowed them whole. Sweat ran cold down their backs as the carrier group shrank behind them. Still intact, still deadly, yet utterly humiliated. They had flown over an enemy carrier deck. They had escaped without a single shot fired, and neither side would ever forget. Yet the silence inside the B-26 did not last long. The engines continued their relentless roar, but beneath it crept a new sound, the subtle, terrifying unevenness of machines pushed too far. Oil pressure flickered. Engine temperatures climbed past safe limits. The Marauder had survived the impossible, but survival came with a price. The crew knew the truth without speaking it. Escape was not yet guaranteed. Behind them, the Japanese carrier group struggled to regain order. Officers barked commands that collided with confusion and shame. No doctrine existed for a bomber that refused to behave like a bomber. Fighters were finally being prepared, but the enemy was already gone. Too low, too fast, too unpredictable. The fleet had been trained to defend against altitude, not audacity. In that gap, the Marauder had slipped through like a ghost. Inside the cockpit, the pilot held the aircraft just meters above the sea. Every instinct screamed to climb, but discipline won. Altitude would make them visible. Altitude would invite pursuit. Down here, radar struggled, gunners guessed, and fighters hesitated. The ocean became both threat and shield. One mistake meant death. But survival demanded proximity to it. The navigator recalculated again, his pencil trembling now, not from fear but exhaustion. The planned route was meaningless. The mission was no longer about targets or objectives. It was about distance. How far could they go before fuel ran dry, before an engine failed, before a Japanese fighter found them alone and vulnerable? Minutes stretched like hours. The radio remained silent. Then came the distant specks. At first they looked like birds, dark dots rising from the horizon. The pilot didn't need confirmation. Fighters. Japanese fighters. Scrambling late but determined. The Marauder had humiliated the fleet, and humiliation demanded response. Speed became their only ally now. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, ignoring the warning signs, demanding more from engines that had already given everything. The B-26 surged ahead, skimming waves so closely that spray kissed the fuselage. The fighters closed slowly, cautiously. They were trained for altitude engagements, not low-level chases where one mistake could send them into the sea. Every second mattered. Every knot of speed bought another breath inside the bomber. The gunners watched helplessly. There was nothing to shoot, no angle, no range. Only faith in the pilot's hands and the Marauder's raw power. Sweat-soaked flight suits. Mouths went dry. No one prayed aloud, but everyone prayed. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the fighters broke off. Fuel, range, risk. The ocean claimed its psychological victory. The Japanese pilots turned back, unwilling to gamble their lives so close to the water for an enemy already bleeding time. The Marauder continued alone once more, battered but unbroken. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to sink in. They had flown over an enemy carrier deck, an act so reckless it bordered on madness. They had exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful fleet. Not with bombs, not with guns, but with speed, nerve, and a refusal to behave as expected. When the American base finally appeared on the horizon, disbelief replaced fear. Ground crews watched the B-26 limp in, scorched, streaked with salt, engines coughing like wounded animals. When it touched down, men ran, not to celebrate, but to confirm it was real. The debriefing room fell silent as the story unfolded. Maps were marked, times were recorded, officers exchanged glances they could not explain. A bomber had flown over a Japanese carrier deck. No shots fired, no losses, no precedent, and somewhere across the ocean, Japanese commanders were rewriting assumptions they had believed unbreakable. The report moved through command channels faster than anyone expected. At first it was treated as exaggeration, another aircrew story sharpened by adrenaline and survival. But radar logs confirmed a low-level contact. Naval intelligence cross-referenced ship positions. Recon photographs taken days later showed disturbed flight decks and hastily rearranged aircraft. The impossible had left fingerprints. In Japan, the reaction was colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. Officers who had stood on that carrier deck replayed the moment again and again in their minds. The sound, the shadow, the humiliation. A single enemy aircraft had violated what was believed to be untouchable. Questions began to circulate, quietly at first. How many more could do the same? How many already had? Doctrine cracked under pressure. Carrier air defense was built around altitude, predictability, and time. The Marauder had taken all three away. Anti-aircraft crews drilled endlessly to depress guns lower. Fighter readiness protocols were rewritten. Deck crews were ordered to treat every sound as a threat. The fleet had not lost a ship, but it had lost certainty. And certainty was everything. Back in American briefings, the tone was different. No medals were immediately promised. No headlines printed. What mattered was understanding. Intelligence officers dissected every second of the flight. They studied the pilot's decision to stay low, the psychological paralysis it caused, the way speed turned an entire fleet into spectators. The lesson was dangerous but undeniable. Sometimes survival was not about firepower. Sometimes it was about refusal to follow expectation. The crew returned to routine duty, but nothing felt routine anymore. Other pilots watched the Marauder differently now, not as a widowmaker, but as a blade when handled without fear. The men who had flown it said little. They didn't need to. Their silence carried weight heavier than any speech. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet never fully shook the moment. Sailors glanced skyward more often. Gunners reacted faster, sometimes too fast. False alarms increased. Fatigue grew. One aircraft had not just crossed a deck, it had embedded itself into the collective memory of a navy that had believed itself invulnerable. War did not change in a single day, but something shifted. Because when power realizes it can be touched, when dominance realizes it can be surprised, the balance begins to tilt quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. The ripple effects of that single flight stretched far beyond reports and briefings. In quiet hangars and smoky planning rooms, officers on both sides began to question assumptions they had treated as laws of nature: speed versus altitude, fear versus instinct, technology versus human decision. The Marauder's flight had not rewritten strategy, but it had underlined a truth war repeatedly, tried to teach, and men repeatedly forgot. Unpredictability was a weapon. American planners never officially endorsed such tactics. No manual suggested flying a medium bomber at wave-top height through a carrier group. But in training fields and mess halls, pilots talked. They talked about momentum, about shock, about what happened when the enemy's mind froze before his weapons could move. The story traveled quietly, stripped of drama, reduced to facts, but its meaning remained sharp. Across the ocean, Japanese naval commanders enforced tighter discipline. Gun crews drilled longer. Lookouts were punished for hesitation. Fighters were kept closer to readiness, engines warmed, pilots tense. Yet tension bred mistakes. Crews jumped at shadows. Ammunition was wasted on false contacts. The fleet had become alert but not calm. And in war, calm mattered more than readiness. The crew of the B-26 carried on with new missions. Each one dangerous in its own way, but none like that day. The pilot noticed the difference first. His hands no longer shook when flak appeared. His breathing slowed when engines complained. He had stared directly into the heart of an enemy fleet and lived. Fear never left, but it no longer ruled. The navigator, too, had changed. Maps were no longer lines and symbols. They were probabilities, instincts, escape routes. He trusted his calculations less than his judgment now, knowing that numbers could not always save you, but decisions sometimes could. The gunners watched the horizon differently, understanding how quickly helplessness could replace power. War ground on. Carriers clashed. Bombers burned. Ships sank. But somewhere in every engagement, a shadow remained, the memory of a bomber that refused to behave correctly. A moment when certainty failed, when doctrine hesitated, when power blinked. That moment did not win the war, but it whispered something dangerous into it. Years later, when the war had ended and silence replaced the roar of engines, that flight still resisted simple explanation. It never fit neatly into official histories or victory summaries. No ships were sunk. No bombs were dropped. No casualty lists recorded its impact. And yet it lingered quietly, stubbornly, like a question no one could fully answer. For the men who had been on that carrier deck, it became a moment frozen in time. Some remembered the sound first, the violent tearing of air, louder than alarms, louder than commands. Others remembered the shadow, stretching across steel, swallowing men whole for a heartbeat. A few remembered the eyes in the cockpit, not filled with hatred, but with determination. They had expected death. What they received instead was something far worse for a warrior's: pride, helplessness. For the crew of the B-26, the memory was heavier. They had not set out to make history. They had simply refused to die when logic said they should. That refusal carried them through the center of a fleet, over a deck that should have been untouchable, and back into the sky. Long after the war, when asked about it, they spoke carefully. Not with pride, not with bravado, but with respect for the thin line between survival and destruction. History often remembers war through numbers: ships sunk, cities destroyed, lives lost. But sometimes the most powerful moments leave no visible scars. Sometimes they leave doubt, and doubt is dangerous. That single Marauder flight planted doubt inside a navy that believed itself secure. It reminded commanders, sailors, and strategists that even the strongest formations could be violated, not by overwhelming force, but by speed, nerve, and a decision made in seconds. The B-26 Marauder would continue to fly. Carriers would continue to sail. War would continue to consume men and machines alike. But somewhere between the waves and the steel, a lesson endured, one never written into doctrine, yet never forgotten by those who learned it the hard way. Because on that day, over the open ocean, an aircraft designed to deliver destruction delivered something else entirely. A warning. That power without adaptability is fragile. That expectation can be a weakness. And that sometimes, the most devastating strike is the one that never fires a single shot. Time moved on, as it always did in war, grinding moments of terror into lines of history. New battles replaced old ones. New losses drowned out earlier miracles. The B-26 Marauder that once screamed over a Japanese carrier deck returned to anonymity, just another aircraft among thousands. Just another crew among countless airmen who carried memories heavier than metals. Yet the moment itself never truly disappeared. It lived quietly in after-action reports, in cautious doctrine changes, and in the minds of those who had witnessed power rendered helpless by surprise. On that carrier deck, Japanese sailors never forgot the sound. Not the alarms, not the shouted orders, but the raw, overwhelming thunder of engines passing so low that death felt physical. Some of those men would survive the war. Some would not. But all of them learned something that day. Superiority was fragile. It could be shattered not only by bombs and shells, but by audacity that arrived faster than fear could react. For the American crew, the memory became something different. Not pride, not glory, but understanding. They had not won a victory in the traditional sense. No ships burned, no flags were raised, yet they had crossed an invisible line between what was considered possible and what was proven achievable when instinct overruled doctrine. They learned that survival sometimes belonged to those willing to do the unthinkable, not the expected. The war would ultimately be decided by industry, sacrifice, and countless acts of courage far larger and far smaller than this one flight. But history is shaped as much by moments as by numbers. And this moment, when a single B-26 flew over Japan's carrier deck and escaped without a single shot fired, became one of those quiet fractures in certainty that wars are built upon, because power relies on predictability, because dominance depends on expectation, and because the instant those expectations are shattered, even the mightiest fleet becomes human again. That day no bombs fell, no guns spoke, yet an entire navy learned fear, not of destruction but of surprise. And somewhere in the vast silence of the Pacific, the echo of that Marauder's engines lingered long after it disappeared. A reminder that in war, the most dangerous weapon is not always firepower. Sometimes, it is the courage to fly straight through what everyone else believes is impossible.